My name is James Carter and I'm 61 years old. At least, I think I am. Time has a funny way of slipping away when the world around you is dead. Keene, New Hampshire, my hometown, is no longer a town. It's a graveyard dressed as a city. The streets are choked with weeds, cars rusting like old tombstones, and the wind carries a hollow whistle that feels almost like voices, mocking, distant, maybe real. I survive by remembering what the world used to be, and by clinging to what remains. Food is scarce, warmth is scarce, and trust is rarer than clean water. For 29 years I've been wandering, scavenging, hiding. Some nights I swear I can hear laughter on the wind. Other nights, the silence is worse than the moaning outside. It was on one of those silent nights that I found the radio. I was searching through the ruins of a general store on Main Street, the shelves long emptied by whoever came before me. Dust settled in thick layers, and the smell of mildew mixed with the faint tang of iron from broken cans. I almost missed it, the small, battered radio sitting on the counter, wires exposed, antenna bent. I plugged in a car battery I'd found in a dumpster, and after a few static-filled moments, it came alive. Static. Endless, crackling static. I almost threw it across the room. But then, I heard it. A faint, broken voice. It sounded human. Survivors, if you're listening, stay in motion. I froze. My hands shook. I hadn't heard a human voice in years that wasn't screaming. Not in real life. My heart hammered in my chest, and for the first time in decades I felt hope, mixed with the strangest sense of fear, like being watched. The voice was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Only the static remained. I adjusted the dial, turned knobs, held my breath. James Carter, remember? My blood ran cold. I jerked the radio away from my ear. My name, how could it know? I checked the streets outside the boarded-up windows, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching. Nothing. Only shadows. Only silence. And yet I couldn't turn it off. Something inside me demanded I listen, demanded I understand. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was the sheer loneliness that had hollowed out my mind over decades. Or maybe someone somewhere was reaching out to me. I scavenged what supplies I could carry and settled in the back room of the store, listening to the static-filled broadcasts. Hours passed. Days. Sometimes the voice returned, faint and broken, sometimes just a single word. Occasionally, I heard fragments of music, songs from a time I barely remembered, songs that reminded me of my family, my wife, my daughter. Lost. All gone. I pressed my ear to the radio, willing it to speak, willing it to tell me that the world wasn't entirely empty. And for the first time in nearly 3 decades, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, the pull of connection. Whatever, or whoever, was on the other end of that radio, I knew my life had changed. The static wasn't just noise anymore. It was a lifeline, and I was going to follow it. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the grime-streaked windows of the abandoned store. The streets of Keene outside were silent except for the occasional groan of metal twisting in the wind. I kept the radio on, propped against a shelf as I sorted through the meager supplies I had scavenged. And then it happened again. Survivors, listen, caution. The static gave way to a human voice, clearer this time. It was raspy but deliberate. Each word felt measured, almost like a warning. I froze, my fingers tightening around a crowbar I kept for protection. James Carter. Trust no one. Route clear, north of river. I dropped the crowbar. My name again. Every hair on my arm stood on end. I knew 2 things. The world had gone insane a long time ago, and somehow this voice knew more about me than it should. I spent hours tuning the dials, adjusting the antenna, experimenting with frequencies. Patterns emerged. Certain words appeared repeatedly: north, safe, river, avoid. Occasionally there were fragments of songs from decades ago, played over the static. It felt deliberate, coded. I wrote everything down in the notebook I carried. If this was a game, I didn't intend to lose. The logic was simple: someone, or something, was broadcasting instructions. Maybe they were helping survivors. Maybe they were luring us into traps. Either way, it demanded attention. By mid-afternoon, I had traced some signals to a rough line pointing toward the Ashuelot River, not far from town. My gut told me it was dangerous, but curiosity gnawed at me. I was alone. I had been alone for years. And for the first time in decades, something, was trying to reach me. The radio crackled again, shorter this time. North, avoid, don't trust, shadows. I shivered. Shadows. That could mean anything. Zombies, humans, or both. Logic told me to be cautious, but my mind kept circling back to the possibility that the broadcasts were genuine. They could be a lifeline. I packed lightly, taking only essentials: canned food, water, a crowbar, a small pistol, and the notebook. I left the store as quietly as I could, the radio clutched under my arm. Every step I took down the empty streets felt like walking through a graveyard, but the radio's faint crackle gave me purpose. As I followed the river north, I saw evidence of those who had come before me. Abandoned campsites, burned-out cars, and signs etched into trees, arrows, warnings, names. Logic dictated caution. Patterns emerged not just in the radio but in the world itself. The signs, the remnants of others, the warnings whispered through static, they all connected. I didn't know who was broadcasting or why it called me by name. But I understood one thing: I had to follow it. For survival. For sanity. And maybe, for the first time in nearly 30 years, for hope. The road to Manchester, New Hampshire was no longer a road at all. Asphalt cracked, grass growing in thick seams, trees claiming the edges like silent sentinels. The further I went from Keene, the heavier the sense of abandonment became. The towns I passed weren't towns, they were tombs, monuments to a world that had ended long before I could truly understand it. I kept the radio on low, tuning it between static bursts and whispered fragments. Every now and then the same voice returned, guiding, warning, taunting. Manchester, streets empty, trust your eyes, North Bridge. I didn't know if this was a lifeline or a trap, but instinct told me to follow it. There was no one else left to ask. No one to tell me what to do. Only the voice, the road, and my own shadow. Manchester was worse than I expected. Cars rotted in the streets, windows shattered, tires flattened. Shop signs hung crookedly, the paint peeling like dead skin. I passed a grocery store where the doors had been forced open, shelves stripped bare. The smell of decay hung in the air, faint but persistent, a reminder that life, once vibrant, had turned sour. I entered an old elementary school on the outskirts of town, looking for supplies and shelter. Desks lay scattered across the floor, some overturned. Graffiti covered the walls, messages scratched in desperation decades ago. One in particular caught my eye. Survivors don't stay. Move north. Shadows follow. I paused. The logic was unsettling. The messages I was finding in the world were mirroring the radio. Someone, or something, was connecting the dots. Or maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But my gut told me otherwise. I scavenged what I could. A few cans of long-forgotten food, a half-empty water bottle, a flashlight, and an old radio battery. The quiet pressed down on me, heavier with each step. I could feel eyes watching me, or maybe that was just paranoia. After nearly 3 decades alone, fear had a way of burrowing under your skin. As night fell, the city became a cathedral of shadows. Streetlights no longer worked. The wind rattled broken windows, sounding like whispers. I crouched in a corner of the school gym, huddled with the radio on, trying to piece together what the voice had meant by North Bridge. And then, in the middle of static, I heard it. Shadows, do not trust, keep moving. The hair on my neck stood up. My mind raced. Was it warning me about zombies? Human threats? Or some hidden danger I couldn't yet understand? Logic demanded caution. Emotion demanded action. I had to keep moving. Sleep came in fragmented bursts, haunted by memories. My wife, Emily, smiling in the garden before the outbreak. My daughter, Lily, playing with a worn doll I still carried in my heart. Memories were sharp, bitter, and impossible to ignore. They were the chains that bound me to humanity, or maybe the weights that would drown me if I lost my mind. When dawn came, I stepped outside, the radio crackling faintly. I followed the voice's instructions, toward the bridge that spanned the river cutting through the city. Every step through Manchester reinforced the truth I had long suspected. The world I once knew was gone. But the logic of survival, patterns, signs, broadcasts, gave me purpose. And as I moved, I felt it, the unshakable, chilling certainty that someone, or something, was watching me, guiding me, or testing me. The 29th year of this outbreak had begun like every year before it. Silent, terrifying, and impossible to forget. Yet somehow, I still had a reason to move forward. By the time I left Manchester, the city's shadows had already begun to stretch across the broken streets. The bridge over the river was silent, except for the wind whistling through twisted metal and the occasional creak of a loose plank. I paused mid-crossing, holding the radio tightly, adjusting its dials for what felt like the 100th time. The static had become a kind of language, a rhythm I could almost understand. Each burst of crackle and hiss was a fragment of something bigger, and I was determined to decipher it. I found a safe spot on the other side of the bridge in what used to be a small storage warehouse. Inside, dust motes floated in beams of sunlight, and crates leaned against walls like skeletons. I set the radio down on a crate, opened my notebook, and began recording every fragment of sound I could catch. North, river, avoid the shadows. James, Carter, trust the line. Safe, coordinates, hidden. I paused. Coordinates. My pulse quickened. Could it be a map hidden in the broadcasts? Some survivor network still functioning after 29 years? Logic demanded caution, but also curiosity. If someone, or something, was guiding me, I had to know why. I began experimenting systematically. I adjusted the antenna in tiny increments, slowly turning the tuning knob in quarter-degree steps. Certain frequencies brought long stretches of static, while others produced faint background noises, low humming, distant footsteps, or the faint echo of voices. Sometimes, the same voice repeated my name, almost like it was tracking my movements. Hours passed. I was exhausted, but the breakthrough came unexpectedly. Hidden in the static, I discerned a pattern. Pauses of different lengths, repeating sequences that resembled Morse code. I wrote it down, dots and dashes, long and short bursts. Then I translated them. Follow river north. Bridge safe at dawn. Shadows move at night. Logic confirmed it. The voice wasn't random. It was sending instructions. Every warning, every fragment of music, every cryptic sentence had a purpose. The system was deliberate. Someone, or something, had thought this through, anticipating where survivors like me might travel. I checked my supplies, securing food and water for the next leg of the journey. The warehouse was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, I kept moving cautiously, guided by the decoded instructions. Night fell. The shadows crept along the walls of the warehouse and beyond into the empty streets. I kept the radio close, listening. The voice came again, almost a whisper through the static. North Bridge, shadows, trust your eyes, and only your eyes. I shivered. The warnings were becoming more precise, more urgent. The logical conclusion was undeniable. The world was full of threats, human or otherwise, and this broadcast was both a map and a shield. I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in decades, I had direction. And yet, the unknown loomed larger than ever. If the voice was right, dawn would bring a safe crossing. Night would bring shadows that I could not afford to ignore. And every frequency I tuned, every signal I deciphered, was another step deeper into a mystery I wasn't sure I was ready to understand. But there was no turning back. The night was unnervingly quiet as I left the warehouse, the radio snug in my pack. The signal had pointed me north, toward a stretch of forested land lining the outskirts of Concord, New Hampshire. Every step I took crunched over broken asphalt and shattered glass, and every shadow seemed alive. My crowbar felt heavy in my hand, my senses sharpened by years of solitude and survival. I had almost convinced myself the warnings were overcaution, until I heard it, a low, guttural growl that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever known. I froze, heart hammering. My eyes darted through the darkness. There, just beyond the edge of the streetlight, I saw a figure. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, and it had that unmistakable stench, the decayed perfume of the dead. Logic told me to retreat, but years of experience had taught me that hesitation could be fatal. I backed slowly toward a nearby alley, trying to keep a barrier between myself and the creature. The growls grew louder, closer. It lunged. I swung the crowbar instinctively, hitting its shoulder. It didn't falter. Its grip was relentless, a raw force of hunger and instinct. I stumbled backward, heart racing, adrenaline pumping. Every nerve screamed survival. I ran. Through empty streets, over toppled cars, past abandoned houses. The creature followed, slow but unstoppable, its groans echoing in the night. Logic dictated one thing: find high ground. I spotted a partially collapsed fire escape leading to a rooftop and scrambled up, dragging myself onto the rusted metal platform. The creature reached the base of the building and roared, swiping at nothing but air, its growls vibrating through my chest. I caught my breath, shaking, staring at the horizon. Concord looked like a city frozen in decay, broken streets, hollow buildings, and the occasional flicker of movement that made my stomach knot. I realized then why the radio had warned me about shadows. This wasn't just a random encounter. The world was crawling with threats, and logic was my only weapon. Stay alert, stay mobile, stay alive. I spent the rest of the night on that rooftop, listening to the radio. Static, then the familiar voice. Shadows move at night. Trust your eyes. North Bridge safe at dawn. The warning had been real. The logic of survival had saved me tonight, but the emotional weight was heavy. Fear had clawed at me like the thing that had chased me, and yet the need to keep moving, to follow the signal, burned stronger than ever. As dawn broke, washing the city in a pale, gray light, I climbed down from the rooftop. The streets were empty again. The creature had vanished, perhaps hunting someone else, or returning to wherever it came from. I checked my supplies, took a deep breath, and started moving north again. Every sense alert. Every shadow suspect. Every crackle of static on the radio a possible lifeline. I had survived the first night in years against a living nightmare. Logic had carried me through, but the emotional cost, fear, exhaustion, the gnawing loneliness, was almost unbearable. Yet I kept walking. Because following the voice, following the pattern, was the only thing that still made sense in a world that had lost all sense. And somewhere ahead, the 29th year of this outbreak had more tests waiting for me. The air smelled of salt and decay as I approached Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The radio crackled faintly, stronger now, almost guiding me like a compass. Logic told me the signal had to originate nearby. No survivor could broadcast so consistently from farther away with the equipment I'd been able to scavenge. The streets were narrower here, older. Brick buildings leaned like weary old men, their windows gaping and broken. The harbor was silent, boats rotting in the shallow water, gulls circling overhead with their raucous cries. Portsmouth was a city frozen in time, a museum of what humanity had lost. I followed the signal to a partially hidden warehouse near the docks. Rusted chains hung across the entrance, and the door had been forced open long ago. Every sense on edge, I stepped inside. The radio was louder here, crackling with urgency. James? Carter, welcome. The voice was familiar, but something in it had changed, more deliberate, more commanding. I moved cautiously, scanning the shadows. Then I found it, a journal lying atop a crate, its leather cover cracked. I flipped it open. The handwriting was neat, precise, someone methodical. The name at the top, Rachel Morgan. Rachel had survived years of the outbreak in this bunker. Her entries described experiments with the infected, studying their behavior, patterns, weaknesses. She wrote about luring them, testing responses, even attempting communication. Some of her methods were cruel but meticulous. Logic had guided her, not emotion. I understood then why the radio messages were so calculated. They weren't just warnings. They were instructions informed by years of observation and experimentation. Some were designed to protect, some to manipulate. Survival had a price, and the world had no room for mistakes. A sound made me freeze. From the shadows, a figure emerged, thin, pale, alert. Rachel. Her eyes scanned me as I raised my hands. "You're not infected," she said, voice steady. "Good. The radio brought you here." I nodded cautiously. You're the one broadcasting?" She smiled faintly. "Partially. I coordinate the signals. Some are automated, some manual. The patterns keep survivors moving safely. Sometimes." "Sometimes?" The word tasted bitter. She glanced at the journal. "Sometimes survival demands sacrifices. Some messages are tests. Some are traps. Logic dictates the outcome." I swallowed. Logic. Always logic. Survival had never been about emotion, not really. But I felt it anyway, fear, relief, suspicion, and something like hope. Rachel had survived by using reason, by controlling chaos, by understanding the infected. And now, for better or worse, she had drawn me into her web. "James," she said quietly, "you've made it this far. That means you can follow rules. That means you can survive. But survival is never simple. The world out there, it will test you again." I nodded, understanding without fully agreeing. Logic could guide me, but it couldn't prepare me for every choice, every shadow, every moral dilemma. The voice on the radio had been a lifeline, but the truth behind it was far more complicated. And as I stood there in that abandoned bunker by the harbor, I realized something chilling. The 29th year of the outbreak was far from over. Rachel led me through a narrow, dimly lit corridor behind the bunker. The walls were lined with shelves of supplies, medical kits, and stacks of canned food, evidence of decades of careful survival. The faint hum of generators echoed, and I realized this was more than a hideout. It was a community, small but organized. As we stepped into a larger room, I saw them. Men and women of all ages, some weathered like me, others younger, almost born into this nightmare. They moved quietly, efficiently, performing tasks with an ease born of long practice. A few glanced at me warily, weapons close at hand. "This is the network," Rachel said softly. "People who have survived by following the patterns, by trusting the signals, and by understanding the risks." The logic was clear. Years of living in a world overrun by the infected had shaped strict rules, routines, and a hierarchy. Each survivor had a role: scouts, hunters, medics, signal operators. Cooperation was essential. Emotion, though present, was secondary. Survival came first. Among them was a young girl, no more than 10, sitting quietly by a generator, scribbling in a notebook. Rachel introduced her as Emma. She had sharp eyes and a calm demeanor that belied her age. Something in her reminded me of my daughter, lost long ago. A pang of grief struck me, a reminder that no amount of logic could erase the wounds of the past. "Hello," I said cautiously. Emma looked up, studying me. After a moment, she nodded. "You follow the signal too?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes. It brought me here." Her eyes softened slightly. "It brought some of us. Some didn't make it." The truth was heavy but logical. The network existed because some followed instructions, some failed, and some had learned the hard way that mistakes were deadly. Every decision, every movement was a calculation. Over the next few days, I learned their routines, the rules of their survival, and the logic behind every broadcast. Rachel explained how signals were sent, how certain frequencies were used to communicate, and how they observed patterns in zombie behavior to protect the community. But emotional tension persisted. Trust was fragile. Bonds were tentative. Everyone had scars, physical, mental, and emotional. Some survivors resented newcomers. Others distrusted authority. I understood immediately that survival was not just about avoiding the infected, but navigating the delicate web of human relationships. I spent hours with Emma, showing her some of the patterns I had noticed in the radio signals. Her eyes lit up with understanding. For a moment, I felt a flicker of connection, the kind of warmth I hadn't felt in decades. It was fleeting, fragile, but it reminded me why I kept moving, why I listened, why I survived. That night, as I lay on a cot in a corner of the room, the radio crackled softly. Rachel had activated it for the nightly broadcast. James, network, learn the patterns, survive together. I realized then that the signals had a purpose beyond mere survival. They were meant to teach, to connect the fragments of humanity that remained. The 29th year of the outbreak had given me more than directions or warnings. It had given me a glimpse of community, and with it, a fragile sense of hope. But hope, I knew, was dangerous. And in this world, danger was never far away. I had settled into a routine with the network, scavenging by day, deciphering the broadcasts by night. The signals were becoming more sophisticated, with coded instructions, Morse fragments, and even subtle warnings embedded in the music snippets. The logic behind them was precise, calculated. I had come to trust the patterns. And then the first warning came too late. It was mid-afternoon when I received the message through the portable radio I carried during supply runs. Bridge unsafe, avoid the northern route. The problem was, the northern bridge was the only practical route to the next supply cache. Trusting the signal, I rerouted along a narrow, overgrown road. At first it seemed clear, safe. But as I moved deeper into the woods, I began to notice signs I had learned to read over the years. Broken branches, scattered clothing, deep gouges in trees, evidence of struggle. And then I saw them. Another survivor, or what was left of one, caught in a trap meant for the infected. The body was barely recognizable, and the road ahead was now littered with tripwires and snares. Logic screamed betrayal. Someone had used the signal to manipulate the movement of survivors, and the consequences were deadly. I ran back to the bunker as quickly as I could, heart hammering. The network was waiting, tense and silent. Rachel's expression was unreadable as I told her what had happened. Some broadcasts are automated, she explained quietly. Some are tests. Some are traps created by other groups. The world didn't end cleanly, James. There are humans who survived by preying on others. The words hit me harder than any zombie attack ever had. For decades, I had feared the infected more than the living. But here, in this fragile network of logic and survival, I realized the truth. Humanity itself had become a threat. Survival depended not just on skill, but on understanding human nature, on deciphering deception as carefully as I decoded signals. I spent that night restless, examining the patterns of previous broadcasts, cross-referencing with maps and known safe zones. Every message, every fragment of static had potential meaning. Some were instructions, some were tests, some were lies. Emotion clawed at me, anger at the cruelty, fear for the innocent, grief for those lost, and the nagging question, could I trust the radio at all? The thing that had once been my lifeline now felt like a double-edged sword. And yet, logic dictated I couldn't ignore it. Even if some messages were traps, the radio still held the key to survival, to navigation, to understanding the world that had become a labyrinth of shadows. I had to learn to distinguish between guidance and manipulation. I had no choice. The 29th year of the outbreak had taught me one hard truth. Trust cautiously, act deliberately, and expect betrayal. And somewhere out there, hidden among the static, the next test was already waiting. The bunker was quieter than usual that night. Most of the network had gone to sleep, huddled in corners or makeshift bunks. I stayed awake, the radio crackling softly beside me. Static filled the room, a constant reminder that even in silence, the world was never truly empty. I pressed my hand against the radio, as if I could feel the pulse of the world beyond these walls. The voice came again, faint but deliberate. Remember, North River, trust your eyes. And suddenly I was back to the early days of the outbreak decades ago when the world had been alive, loud, and full of ordinary worries. I remembered Emily, my wife, standing in the kitchen of our home in Keene, her hair tied back, laughing at some trivial thing I'd said. Lily, my daughter, running across the lawn, clutching a worn doll she refused to leave behind. That morning the air smelled of cut grass and sunlight. Normal. Safe. Gone. Logic had saved me in those early days too. I remembered barricading our house after the first news reports, checking doors, windows, keeping a meticulous record of supplies. But emotion had betrayed me, fear, indecision, and the desperate hope that our family could survive together had cost us dearly. One night, the infected broke through the perimeter. Emily didn't make it. Lily. I never found her. I closed my eyes. Memories can be a form of logic too. They teach you what works and what fails. That early trauma had trained me to read patterns. In people, in the infected, in the signals that might mean life or death. The radio's instructions, the network's routines, even Rachel's moral compromises, all of it now made sense in the context of the lessons I had learned too late. Yet, emotion remained unavoidable. Grief was a constant shadow, sometimes sharp as a knife, sometimes dull and lingering. Loneliness was a second skin. And hope was a dangerous thing, a spark that could save you or blind you. I opened my notebook and wrote carefully, "Memory is survival. Logic is survival. But memory without logic can kill you. Logic without memory can make you forget why you survive." The radio crackled again. A faint melody this time, one I remembered from Lily's favorite childhood record. My chest tightened. For a moment, hope and grief collided, a bitter mixture of comfort and pain. Logic demanded I keep moving, to continue decoding, surviving, planning. Emotion demanded I remember, to honor those lost, to hold on to fragments of humanity. And in that quiet night, surrounded by static and shadows, I realized they were not mutually exclusive, they were intertwined. The 29th year of the outbreak was more than survival. It was memory, logic, and the fragile thread of emotion, all woven together into the delicate fabric of life I still clung to. And I had no intention of letting go. The radio had been quiet for nearly 2 days, except for the occasional bursts of static. I had almost convinced myself that the last incident, the trap near Concord, was a warning to slow down, to remain cautious. But then the broadcast returned, louder, sharper, more urgent than before. Boston, northeast, follow the river, signal strongest near city ruins. Boston. The name felt like a challenge, a promise, and a threat all at once. Logic told me the journey would be dangerous. Boston was a sprawling urban landscape, long overrun, densely populated with the infected and likely hostile human survivors. But the signal was precise. It wasn't random. Someone wanted me to follow it. I spent hours planning, poring over maps I had scavenged, calculating distances, supply needs, and likely hazards. I packed lightly: water, rations, my crowbar, pistol, notebook, and the radio. Every item had a purpose. Logic dictated I move efficiently and deliberately. The first leg of the journey took me through the forests north of Portsmouth, along winding rivers and overgrown roads. The sun was my ally, giving me visibility while shadows could conceal threats, both living and dead. The further I traveled, the clearer the pattern became. The voice on the radio not only guided me, but also predicted areas of danger and safety. On the second night, I camped near a ruined farmhouse. The radio crackled again. "Avoid the main road. Travelers may not be friendly. Trust your eyes, observe before moving." I understood immediately. Logic over emotion. Every step in this world was a calculation. Every decision carried weight. Along the way, I encountered the first evidence of human conflict. A roadblock, burned cars, scattered supplies. The signs were subtle: footprints, improvised barricades, symbols etched into walls. Some were warnings, some traps. But they all followed patterns, and patterns were predictable if you observed carefully. The closer I got to Boston, the more fragmented the landscape became. Towns were reduced to skeletons of their former selves, highways overgrown and cracked. I navigated by rivers, ruins, and the intermittent signals from the radio. Each day was a test of endurance, vigilance, and judgment. And yet, beneath the logic, the emotional tension remained. I felt the weight of isolation, the echo of my family's absence, the unrelenting pressure of survival. But I also felt determination. Following the signal was more than survival, it was purpose. By the third night, the Boston skyline, skeletal and shadowed, appeared on the horizon. The radio signal was strongest here, crackling with a sense of urgency. The city promised answers or perhaps more danger. Either way, I had no choice but to move forward. The 29th year of the outbreak had pushed me from the shadows of isolation into the heart of uncertainty. Logic dictated movement, observation, and preparation. Emotion drove persistence, hope, and the fragile spark of human connection. And somewhere within the ruined streets of Boston, the signal awaited, ready to test both. Boston was a city of skeletons. High-rises leaned precariously, bridges were fractured, and the streets were overgrown with weeds and twisted metal. The skyline, jagged against the gray sky, felt more like a tomb than a city. Every shadow seemed alive, every alley a trap. Logic dictated caution, observation, and patience. It didn't take long before I realized I wasn't alone. From a distance, I saw movement, figures cautiously navigating the debris-strewn streets. Not infected. Not exactly. Humans. Survivors. I watched from the safety of a partially collapsed building. There were at least 5 of them, armed with scavenged weapons and makeshift armor. They paused at intersections, checking for threats, communicating in hushed whispers. I recognized the signs: territorial behavior, signs of previous conflict. Logic screamed that any interaction could be dangerous. Yet I had no choice but to approach. I needed supplies, knowledge, and perhaps allies. And sometimes, survival demanded calculated risk. I made my move slowly, hands raised, showing I meant no harm. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a scar across her cheek, stepped forward, weapon trained on me. "Who are you?" she demanded. "James Carter," I said, voice steady. "I'm following a signal. I mean no harm." The group exchanged glances. Logic dictated caution on both sides. After tense moments, the woman lowered her weapon slightly. "Signal?" she asked. "You mean the radio?" I nodded. "Yes. The patterns, the broadcasts. They led me here." Her eyes widened slightly. "You're not the only one. But don't think for a second that following it guarantees survival. It's complicated." Over the next hours, I learned why. The city was divided between several survivor factions, each with different rules, ethics, and levels of trust. Some were cooperative, others predatory. Some listened to the radio, others ignored it entirely. Logic dictated observation first, engagement second. Mistakes were fatal. Emotion complicated things further. One of the younger members of the faction, a boy no older than 15, reminded me painfully of Lily. The sight of him, terrified yet determined, triggered a surge of protectiveness I hadn't felt in decades. My instinct was to shield him, to guide him, to preserve a fragment of innocence in this fractured world. But logic reminded me, attachments could be dangerous. Trust had to be earned, carefully measured. By nightfall, I had learned enough to navigate the group's hierarchy, observing alliances, weaknesses, and patterns of behavior. I stayed on alert, aware that one wrong move could turn me from ally to target. The radio crackled softly that evening. The voice returned, familiar and urgent. "Boston, network expands, shadows move, choose your path." I realized the signal was more than guidance, it was a test. Every decision, every interaction, every step in the ruined streets of Boston would determine survival. Logic would guide my actions. Emotion would influence my choices, and both would be tested in the days ahead. The 29th year of the outbreak had thrown me into a world of complex human interaction, where survival depended not just on avoiding the infected, but on understanding the living. And in Boston, every shadow, every signal, every human face could mean life or death. The heart of Boston was a labyrinth of collapsed streets and skeletal skyscrapers. Following the radio signal brought me to an old government research facility, long abandoned and partially flooded. Its steel doors were rusted, but I managed to pry them open. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and the metallic tang of decay. The radio crackled incessantly, more insistent than ever. Its signal was strongest here, almost overwhelming. Logic told me that this was the source, the origin of the broadcast that had guided me, warned me, and tested me for weeks. I descended into the facility, flashlights slicing through darkness. Hallways were lined with faded signage, quarantine labs, restricted access, biohazard. Each step echoed in the empty corridors. The logic of survival demanded caution. Traps, structural weaknesses, or the infected could lurk anywhere. In one lab, I found a series of government archives. Files, computers, and recordings. Dust-covered terminals flickered weakly with residual power. I started combing through the data, and what I discovered chilled me to the bone. The outbreak hadn't been natural. A series of experiments aimed at weaponizing a virus had gone catastrophically wrong. Containment protocols failed. Early attempts to quarantine cities had collapsed. And in the chaos, the government had deployed automated broadcasts to guide survivors, maintain order, and in some cases, manipulate human behavior for controlled testing. I realized then why some messages had been traps, why patterns were deliberate, and why Rachel's network existed. The signals were a combination of survival instructions, experimental testing, and control mechanisms designed to shepherd humanity, or parts of it, through the collapse. Logic, efficiency, and observation were the core of this system. Emotion, morality, and human connection were secondary, often expendable. A recording played automatically, faint and static-riddled. A voice, official yet distorted, explained, "If you are hearing this, the containment failed. The survivors must be guided. The infected are beyond control. Follow the signals for survival or perish." The weight of knowledge pressed down on me. Logic and morality collided. The 29 years of the outbreak, the deaths I'd witnessed, the betrayals, the loneliness, they were all consequences of human error and calculated survival strategies. Emotion surged despite the logic. Anger at the deceit. Grief for the lost, fear for the future. And beneath it all, a spark of understanding. This knowledge, as horrible as it was, gave me power, the ability to navigate the chaos, to make choices, to survive with awareness. Rachel's warnings echoed in my mind. Survival is never simple. The world out there, it will test you again. I left the facility with the recordings and archives, careful to note every detail, every pattern. The radio continued to guide me, but now I understood why and how it worked. It was a tool, a lifeline, a weapon, and a test. The 29th year of the outbreak had revealed a truth I hadn't expected. Humanity had failed itself, but logic, observation, and careful choice could still carve a path forward. The next steps would not be easy, but at least now I knew what I was facing. I sat in the corner of the Survivor Network's main room, the government archives spread before me. Every file, every recording, every fragment of data pressed a single truth into my mind. Knowledge was power, and with power came responsibility. But responsibility in this world was a dangerous thing. Rachel watched me quietly. "You've seen it," she said. "Now you have to decide what to do with it." I rubbed my face, exhaustion pressing down. Logic dictated multiple options. Option 1, share everything. The survivors would gain unprecedented understanding, how the outbreak started, how the infected behave, and how the signals are constructed. This could save lives. but it could also make them targets. Knowledge in the wrong hands was a weapon. Option 2, selective sharing. I could provide just enough information to guide survival, withholding the deeper truths of manipulation and government testing. Fewer lives might be at risk, but some survivors would be left in ignorance. Option 3, secrecy. I could keep the information to myself, using it to protect only a small group, Rachel's network, or even just Emma and me. Morally questionable but strategically safe. Emotion clashed with logic. I thought of Emma sitting quietly in a corner, her sharp eyes following my every move. I thought of the boy I had seen in Boston, terrified but alive. I thought of Lily and Emily, lost decades ago, victims of chaos and human error. Could I risk more loss? Could I bear the guilt? Rachel broke the silence. Logic will get you through most days. Morality will get you through the nights. But here, you need both. I closed my eyes and drew a deep breath. Logic and morality didn't always align, but I had survived this long by balancing them carefully. The decision I made now would ripple outward, affecting lives I couldn't predict. I opened my eyes. We share what we can safely use, I said. We teach the patterns, the signals, the survival strategies. But the origins, the traps, the experiments, the government, that stays hidden. For now. We give people tools to survive, not reasons to die. Rachel nodded slowly, a mixture of relief and approval in her eyes. Then we prepare. The next phase is coming. I turned to the radio. The crackle seemed almost impatient, as if aware that I now understood more than ever before. The signal wasn't just guidance anymore, it was a test of judgment, of character, of the balance between logic and emotion. The 29th year of the outbreak had taught me many lessons: fear, loss, grief, and betrayal. But it had also taught me that survival was about more than escaping death. It was about choosing what kind of person you would be, and what kind of world, even in fragments, you would protect. As night fell, I set the archives aside and prepared to teach, to guide, and to protect. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and shadows. But I had made my decision. And for the first time in decades, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt purpose. I was in the central hall of the bunker, teaching the network how to interpret signals safely. Emma sat close, scribbling notes as I explained patterns, warnings, and what to look for in the static. The others listened intently, some skeptical, some eager. Logic dictated precision. Emotion dictated patience. Both were necessary. Then the radio changed. The usual static erupted into a sharp, crackling crescendo. I froze, recognizing the voice immediately, but this time it was different, layered, almost pleading. James Carter, final, prepare, the shadows, converge, truth awaits. The words cut through the room like ice. The network fell silent. Even Rachel, usually composed, stiffened. I felt my chest tighten. The signal was urgent, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Logic kicked in. The message implied movement, a convergence, perhaps a trap, but possibly the last opportunity for vital information. I had to act. I packed the radio, notebooks, and essential supplies. Emma grabbed my hand instinctively. Her eyes, wide with fear, mirrored my own memories of Lily decades ago. I squeezed back, a silent promise. As we stepped outside, the city of Boston lay in shadow. The ruined streets were eerily quiet. Broken buildings loomed like tombstones. And in the distance, I could see figures moving, shadows, as the message had warned. They weren't all infected. Some were human, survivors testing us, tracking us, waiting. Trust, your eyes, trust. The voice crackled one final time before fading into static. The logic of survival screamed. Observe, calculate, advance cautiously. The radio was silent. No further guidance. No reassurance. Just us, the network, and the shadows converging from every direction. I took a deep breath. Fear was there, sharp, cold, but so was determination. I had learned, over 29 years, to combine observation, pattern recognition, and moral choice. I had learned to act even when the outcome was uncertain. I glanced at Emma and the others. They were counting on me, and I was counting on myself. The 29th year of the outbreak had brought me full circle, from isolation to community, from blind survival to guided action, from fear to purpose. The shadows moved closer. I raised my crowbar, checked the pistol, and stepped forward into the ruined streets. And I walked because that was all any of us could do. The streets of Boston stretched before us, fractured and silent, save for the occasional groan of the infected and distant echoes of human activity. Shadows moved in every corner, some hunched and shambling, others cautious and deliberate. Logic dictated observation, stealth, and calculated movement. Emotion demanded courage, care, and the protection of the fragile bonds I had rebuilt over weeks of travel and survival. Emma held my hand tightly, her trust both a comfort and a responsibility. The network followed, tense but disciplined, each survivor aware that a single mistake could mean death. The radio remained silent. The final transmission had ended, leaving only static and memory. I realized something fundamental. The guidance had always been a test, not a guarantee. Survival was never about blind obedience. It was about interpretation, decision-making, and resilience. As we moved through the skeletal city, I reflected on everything that had led to this point. The early days of isolation, when fear and grief were constant companions. The patterns and logic that had kept me alive, step by step, signal by signal. Rachel's network, a fragile but organized structure of human resilience and morality. The betrayals, traps, and manipulations that taught me caution and discernment. The memory of my family, which guided my moral compass, even when logic demanded cold calculation. Boston was a test of all of it. Every ruined street, every building, every shadow demanded that I combine reasoning with instinct, knowledge with emotion, and observation with courage. We reached a vantage point atop a collapsed overpass, overlooking the city. The sun broke through the gray clouds for the first time in days, casting long, jagged shadows. The network paused, silent, taking in the ruined horizon. I raised the radio, letting the static fill the quiet moment. No instructions came. That was the lesson. Survival was now entirely ours. The signals had guided us, tested us, and prepared us, but the future would be forged by the choices we made in the shadows. I looked at Emma. "We move forward," I said. "Together." She nodded, and for the first time in 29 years, I allowed myself a small measure of hope. Logic, memory, morality, they had carried me here. And while the world remained broken, haunted, and dangerous, we still had agency, still had purpose, and still had each other. The 29th year of the outbreak was not the end. It was the beginning of a new calculus, a fragile balance between life and death, fear and courage, logic and emotion. And in that balance I realized we could survive, not just as isolated fragments of humanity but as something more. A network, a family, a story still being written. The radio crackled faintly in the distance. Perhaps it was static. Perhaps it was a signal. Perhaps it was a warning. We moved forward anyway.